We're moving on to our next panel, which is on civilian personnel reform. And we have, again, an extremely distinguished panel. I'm going to start with Veronica Hinton, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with for several years now. Veronica has served as the Principal Director for Civilian Personnel Policy. You are still the Principal Director, that's correct, okay. And at times as the acting DASD for Civilian Personnel Policy for the Department of Defense. She previously served in similar roles in the Department of Treasury and the Department of Air Force. Not only have I enjoyed working with Veronica, but I particularly appreciate that in a department that often overlooks its civilian employees and the critical contribution that they make to the national defense every day, Veronica is out there fighting for them and taking their best interests in mind all the time. So thank you, Veronica, for that. And thank you for being here. Next, we have Howard Risher, an independent consultant who has served as compensation practice leader for national consulting companies and as a senior fellow at the Wharton School Center for Human Resources. I first became aware of Howard's work when he helped write a NAPA report on employee compensation back around 2000. We had a disagreement as to when it was. Maybe you looked it up, but sometime around 2002, 2003, 2004, that helped justify the national security personnel system, which I was engaged with from the congressional side. Howard is our designated bomb thrower on the panel. We're looking forward to his contribution. He has never been afraid to pull his punches when he thinks that something is wrong with the federal civil service system. Finally, we have Janet Hale, who served as the first Undersecretary for Management at the Department of Homeland Security before becoming a director and senior advisor on government policy and operations at Deloitte & Touche. She's also served in senior positions at HHS, HUD, Transportation, and OMB. I don't know how you found time to squeeze all that into a single career.
I can't hold a job.
But Janet has seen government management from more angles than just about anybody. And I particularly enjoyed serving with her on the recent panel of the National Academy of Public Administration on the future of OPM, where she impressed me with her deep understanding of the civil service system and the federal workforce. Our moderator for this panel is David Graham, an IDA research staff member and another winner of the Good Pastor Award for Excellence in Research, an expert on DoD organization and management processes. He's worked on a number of important papers on the DoD workforce as well, and I'm privileged to have had the opportunity to work with him on a number of projects in my short career at IDA, and I'm sure you will enjoy hearing from him as much as I do. So Dave, over to you. Thank you.
So thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this session today. Three very important topics. But I must say that the civilian workforce topic is near and dear to my heart. So I'm very excited to be part of this panel. And I want to thank you, Peter, for inviting me to be involved in this effort. In the coming next couple of years, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the all-volunteer force, and which has been an amazing public policy success. And one of the topics that we'll be discussing and thinking about the all-volunteer force is what it's going to take to succeed with the force into the future. The American economy and society is changing, and the challenges with building the all-volunteer force are, I think, kind of apparent to all of us. The reason this panel is so near and dear to my heart is that when I think of the force of DODs, it comprises on the order of 3 million people, a little over 3 million people. And of those 3 million people, about 20% are civilians. And of those 3 million people, another 20% are what we call service contractors, who are people who are working very closely with the government. So in thinking about the success of the all-volunteer force going forward, I think it's absolutely imperative to think about how to succeed with our civilian workforce, and coupled with that, how they interact with our service contractors. So this is a central topic to the future of the department. And since we're talking about management reform today, I want to just echo the points that Dr. Chu made and others, that there is a grassroots element of reform, and that requires that everyone in this 3 million person force have the proper incentives, but it also requires that individuals be developed to have the competence required to act independently and with authority, and that their careers be developed and managed appropriately. So we have three really interesting experts here today, accomplished professionals in this field, and I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. Veronica will talk a bit about DoD. I understand, talk a bit about DoD's priorities in this area going forward. Howard has a very nice briefing on general issues, particularly compensation. And Janet will talk about her management experiences and what that means for reform going forward. So with that, let me turn it over to Veronica.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the IDA team for this important discussion. I'm very honored to be here to talk about the work that we've been doing in the area of civilian human resources reform, not only what we've done, but what we're doing. And very honored to be here with Ms. Hale, whose career I followed over the years in enterprise management functions, and Mr. Risher, who is a leading and influential voice in this discussion. In my role as Principal Director for Civilian Personnel Policy, I help lead and strategize on civilian human resource management reform for the department's 930,000 civilian employees. And as Dave mentioned, a significant proportion of the department's overall workforce. And so what I'd like to do today is share a little bit about reforms we've made, particularly in hiring, as well as advancements in outreach and recruitment, right? How do we get our talent in, not just in ways that we've done historically and traditionally, but also in what we're thinking about in modernizing and reforming hiring. And Peter has been a great partner in that discussion and shaping our thoughts on that. And I'd also talk a little bit about the role of analytics in that conversation. And on the last panel, we heard many of the members talk about the importance of data analytics as a decision support tool. And certainly that's front and center from our thoughts in terms of human capital management, human capital strategies, and managing the civilian workforce. But before I do that, I want to just expound a little bit on some of David's thoughts around the demographics of the civilian workforce, because it's challenging. And I'm sure many folks come and talk about the complexity and the scope of the department and what that means in terms of trying to bring some order to how we manage our various business functions depending on where we fit. So, as I mentioned, we have about 945,000 employees in 22 countries worldwide. 64% of them are appropriated fund general schedule, 17% are in the wage system, our blue collar system, and the rest are in other alternative personnel systems, and 46% of the civilian workforce are veterans. And I raise that because that's one of the questions I quite frequently get is, as you think about reform, what does that mean in terms of traditional hiring authorities, traditional ways of honoring veterans' preference and our veterans service in the civil service? And so you will hear me talk about veterans representation rates a couple of times throughout our conversation today. So in order to manage this just broad sweeping workforce that's comprised of over 500 different occupational series, we organize them into functional communities. And functional communities are like mission areas, and we work with those mission owners as our partners to help them understand what are the skills, what is the talent they need, how do they need to manage it, how do they need to develop it, and how do we in the human capital community come together with them in order to identify the right solutions, the right levers to make sure that they're getting the talent they need to have an effective mission. And I say all that to just say, there's no one size fits all solution. We have a multitude of, whether it's hiring authorities, personnel systems, a lot of flexibility in the department to really make sure that we're positioned to continually revitalize that workforce and improve the resiliency of all segments of that workforce. And we work in partnership with our human capital partners to really try to bring a strategic and integrated perspective to managing that workforce. That's something that we do very naturally on the military side, something that we're growing on the civilian side in terms of making sure that it's not an ad hoc management of that civilian workforce, that it is a deliberate, integrated approach, bringing the most effective and most modern strategies, policies, and processes to bear in that particular area. So what I want to talk about today are I'm going to focus prominently on hiring, but I'm going to touch on data analytics. I'm going to touch on what we're doing to transform the HR community, because at the end of this is a human capital community that's working in partnership, and they need to be effective in being able to be those business partners. So I'll touch on all three of those. But before we do any of that, you have to know, you have to sit down and figure out where you want to go and develop a plan so you know when you get there and how you measure it. And it's really part of this idea of pivoting from what has historically been a compliance enforcement human capital function to a performance outcome function. And so central to this is our efforts in the past several years to develop our human capital operating plan. And that plan touches on strategies and initiatives to deliver talent, to maximize employee performance, and to transform HR. And across all of that, that plan has been aligned to the outcomes in the National Defense Strategy, as well as the National Defense Business Operations Plan. And so we look at that and take a step back and go, what are the human capital needs to achieve those strategic outcomes? And then what particular initiatives are we going to pursue and actions to get there? And we've identified over 150 metrics to support that plan as we do that performance culture pivot to make sure that the actions we're taking are actually having the intended outcomes. So when we think about delivering talent, we think about hiring, the actual act of hiring, talent acquisition. We think about strategic outreach and partnerships, and we think about our force renewal programs, our internships, our scholarships, our fellowships. And we've made a lot of great strides that I want to talk about, and then also what we're doing. And so I'll focus first on hiring authorities, because I think any engagement that I go to, the very first question I get, or the very first comment I get is, the hiring system's broken. I can't get the talent I need, or it takes too long, or you name it. I've probably been told that in many forms or different fashions. And so we took a concerted effort over the last several years to really bring to bear an effort to simplify, streamline, and standardize the hiring process to make sure that it's useful, usable, and used. We've been very fortunate. Congress has given the department many different hiring authorities and flexibilities to recruit the talent we need. We've been in competition with the private industry, particularly in our innovation workforce, our digital workforce. But the outcome of that, all of those authorities have been increasingly complex hiring system. You don't know how to engage it. You don't know, am I going to use this authority or that authority? How do those authorities intersect? They're all a little different. And it really just made it not only difficult for the HR community, but difficult for our hiring managers to be able to articulate their needs, requirements, so that we can help them find where they find the talent. And so we took an effort to streamline 20 standalone different direct hiring authorities and worked not only within the department, but also with Congress to identify opportunities to streamline those authorities into one consolidation. And in FY20, in the National Defense Authorization Act, we were granted one streamlined hiring authority that covers our science and technology workforce, our acquisition workforce, many of our critical skills areas, and mission priorities. And that really led us to be able to simplify our hiring process. And why is that important? So I'm going to give you some metrics just to punch home how impactful these authorities have been. One of the questions I get is, are these authorities effective? Are they efficient? And are we actually using them? And we as a community, civilian personnel community, have been measuring that so that we can articulate to our customers as well as to DoD leadership what we're seeing. And so over the past 5 years, we've driven overall time to hire down from 111 days in FY17 to 83 days in FY20. So it's a significant drop in the overall average. And as of July of this year, we were close to achieving our target for 21, which is 74 days. We were at 79 days. So it's not just the transactional act, it's the importance of measuring and making sure that the work that we're doing is achieving the outcomes that we want. So we've been very pleased to look at that. We've been looking at our direct hire authorities to determine whether or not they're having the impact that we want. And we're seeing that same trend in timeliness. And then we also measure to make sure that these authorities and these reforms aren't negatively impacting or disparately impacting specific segments of the population. And as I mentioned, our veterans representation rate has remained consistent through the years, these last several years, at 46 to 47%. So even though we're using these reforms to fill our positions, and on average, the department does about 300,000 hiring actions per year, of which 100,000 are new hires where we go out and we renew and refresh the workforce. We want to make sure that we're still maintaining and honoring our commitment to veterans, that we're preserving merit, and that we're keeping a track of all the different trends and behaviors and dynamics. And so as we look to what's next in this particular space, we're focusing on the artificial intelligence innovation workforce. Whether you've read reports from the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence or just thought leaders in this space, we recognize that we need to focus our attention specifically on making sure that we can acquire this talent, this exquisite talent, as we like to say, make sure that we're developing them, looking at our current models and figuring out if those are the right models for management and development. I'm also thinking about how we assess those particular candidates' qualities. Can we introduce things like e-portfolio reviews, subject matter expert panels into assessing candidate qualifications? So it's taking that next step to having a more modern process of finding talent, assessing talent, and then onboarding talent. And that's a really good segue to think about kind of what I'm thinking about as I turn my focus from hiring authorities to my next priority area in this space. It's really about outreach and partnership. So we've over the last several years have allowed our recruitment capability for the civilian side to atrophy. Not that it was a very robust active recruitment capability. You know, we like to say it's post and pray, put it on USA Jobs. Hopefully you get the people you want. These hiring authorities have enabled us to change that focus, to rapidly get the talent once we identify it, but we've got to be able to identify it. And so we've really focused on getting the word out. One of our studies we've done recently, 27% of college students aren't even thinking about DoD as a potential employer. And I would actually say 34% think of the government as an employer, and it's even less for DoD. So when they think of DoD, they think about uniform service. And so one of our priorities in the coming years is not only to increase awareness of all the different opportunities to make impact as a civilian in the department, global impact. It's also to make sure that we're actively understanding through research, marketing, survey, what are those trends, what are those behaviors, what are those thoughts, and then actually build a robust recruitment capability to go out and target, whether it's critical skills, whether it is underserved communities for our diversity and inclusion, really go to where the talent is. And we'll talk a little bit about lessons learned from the pandemic that'll feed into that as well, because I think it's our traditional thoughts around where we find talent has evolved over the last 18 months. We've launched a new website, dodciviliancareers.com. Please, dodciviliancareers.com, that's my plug. Very, very proud of that in the work that we've done to, in a modern dynamic medium and method, explain what it is to work as a civilian in DoD, all the different opportunities, where we have positions, how talent can figure out where they fit based on their skill sets. So that's a little bit about what we've done. What we're looking at next is we have so many different pathways to entering DoD, whether it's through student programs, internships, traditional hiring. We are working to expand the functionality of that website in terms of interfacing with other job boards, consolidated vacancy lists, as well as bringing all our different scholarship and employment programs together in one place. So if you're interested in working for the department, you can go to dodciviliancareers.com and find a central repository, whether it's a program that research engineering is sponsoring, or acquisition and sustainment, or in the military department, one central place, right? And some of this is common sense that you think we should be doing as an employer, and we're just bringing that to bear in a more modern, dynamic ways. The other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of hiring reform that we've been working on is our variety of scholarship programs. We have very specific scholarship and fellowship programs, whether it's the Science, Mathematics, and Research for Transformation, the SMART program that R&E manages, or it's our new McCain Fellows program, where we had our inaugural cohort graduate this past year with 22 fellows, or it's our Born Fellowship, which is targeted to language and national security, where students can earn scholarships in turn for service at the end of those scholarships. We're really trying to bring to bear kind of an integrated strategy on how do those particular fellowship and development areas work together in a broader strategic human capital strategies to make sure that we can identify the resources that we need and entice our students into federal service and build out those networks and those partnerships and the outreach with our universities to make sure that talent thinks about us as an employer of choice and finds a pathway to service, particularly for our underserved communities where unpaid internships and unpaid employment opportunities may be barriers for underserved communities to come into government. And so one of the things we're looking at as we think about revitalizing the workforce and revitalizing the pipeline is how can we ensure that we're offering paid internships so that no one has to worry about coming to DC, a high cost of living area, as an intern to be able to build the public service bona fides. So just touching on just real wave tops there, what we've done in hiring reform. The other piece before I pause is this idea of data analytics. And so how do we look at understanding talent demand tools and making sure that we have talent demand tools that help us understand trends in the broader labor force. So when we're making mission decisions, I'll pick on our Army's Futures Command, it's in Austin, as they're looking to recruit into a high cost of living area, one of the things we can use with this new talent development tool and really building that capability is understand, who are we competing with from a salary perspective, from a talent perspective. Are there the competencies that we need in the workforce in that particular local area as we think about basing, as we think about recruitment strategies? How do we make sure that we are bringing in data into that conversation, which is an area that we hadn't necessarily done a lot of, and now we're incorporating those competencies for our human resource professionals more broadly to be more effective in the hiring. And that really is a good pivot to think about what we're doing to transform HR. One of the things that has been very critical for us is personnel is a treasure trove of data. There's so much data out there in our personnel databases, but you have to go drill and find it and really understand what you're looking for from a manual perspective. And we've been working very closely with our counterparts in our chief data officer office, as well as in our comptroller, to build out the data visual tools and the data analytics tools so that we can incorporate predictive analysis and AI to really understand what is going on with whether it's in hiring, whether it's in performance, whether it's in time to hire, direct hire, across all the dynamics of the portfolio. What is the data telling us? So then we can inform policy, we can inform decisions. And I'll give you a specific example. As we've worked through the pandemic, we've looked at lessons learned and things we've looked at what our workforce has been doing in terms of leave that they're taking, telework that they're taking, and we've been able to incorporate our payroll data with our personnel data to actually see down to the installation level, down to the occupational level, what are pockets of individuals who are using, for example, weather and safety leave. That's leave where people are at home for safety protocol. They're not working, they're not teleworking. We want to understand that so we know where is their lost productivity so that we can surge resources. So that's an example of how we're using data analytic tools to drive policy. And then I'll just close with lessons learned from the pandemic, because I think it's very critical as we think of the last 18 months. Before the pandemic, we teleworked about 3% of the time in the civilian workforce. At the height of the pandemic, we were up to 60%. There was a lot of cultural hesitancy in the department to embracing telework as a talent management strategy. And what we have found from a cultural perspective is folks are embracing it and they understand the value now as using that as a flexibility tool. We've settled at about 35% of the workforce teleworking. And I raise that because as we think about from a civilian hiring perspective, what that means is, you heard me say, go to where the talent is. So now we can think about what is the role of telework in attracting people to the department, right? That's that work-life flexibility, that's that work-life alignment. But also the role of remote work in letting us think about, if I can't attract talent to come to Austin, or if I can't attract talent to come to DC, or folks need to stay where they are, maybe now, depending on the type of position and mission, I can actually find the talent I want in the location that they're at, in places that don't necessarily normally think about public service. And so it's opened up a whole new way of thinking about talent acquisition. It's opened up a whole new way of identifying our candidate pool. So we're very excited about the opportunity that this has proven for us in terms of bringing reform to the hiring area. So I said a mouthful. I wanted to hit the wave tops across everything that we've done. Haven't even touched on other areas, but I'm really excited for the questions that you'll have for me, and I will turn it back over to Dave.
Great, thank you, Veronica. That was terrific. Howard has some slides.
Let me start by saying that I just heard a very useful and instructive presentation, but never at any point did Veronica mention pay. And it's just incredible to me. This is like the biggest single expense in the civilian personnel area, and nobody ever talks about it. I mean, it's like the sacrosanct system that's existed for how many now? My God, 70 years without any significant change. Nobody talks about it though. And I just don't understand it. If you went to any other sector, that would not be true. So, at any rate, the bottom line back there is important, I think, is that the GS system is broken. I mean, there is nothing about it that is working well. You could not defend that system for any reason whatsoever. It's incredibly bureaucratic. The idea that you have to come up with all these mechanisms to be able to work around the idea that you need competitive pay, but nobody talks about it at any point. It's just unbelievable to me. So.
It's resignation, Howard.
What's that?
It's resignation.
Well, maybe it is resignation. I don't know.
Not that we don't talk about it.
A quick story. One of the things that I was a guy who managed the project for pay reform back in 1990. So that's my claim to fame, I guess. And I've been involved. There was a Napa study back about that same time. I was involved with this guy named Doc Cook. I know who's a magical name around here. 2004, but I think the report was issued that Peter was talking about. And that was the interesting thing there was I was working with two people. The team had two other people on it that had been essentially, they didn't use the term human capital officer at that point, but they had been director of personnel in Army and, as I remember, Navy. I think it was Navy. I'm not sure anymore. Air Force or Navy. And we had tried at that point as part of a Napa team to get people to come in and interview people about the NSPS. And they were unable to make appointments at that point. DOD refused to talk to Napa. Somehow that said a lot to me. The other issue that goes into that same report is that, to my knowledge, I was never able to identify anyone involved in that project at that point at DOD that had any real expertise on compensation management. To this day, OPM, quite frankly, does not have anyone, to my knowledge, again, who has any real expertise on compensation management. But the single biggest expense on civilian personnel is pay, but nobody there knows anything about it. It's incredible to me sometimes. So, at any rate, the other issue that goes into this, she was talking about hiring, and I quite frankly find it appalling that it even takes 80 days to hire somebody. But the real issue that jumps out at me is I hear these reports about people quitting early, new hires quitting early. And if there's any red flag that this agency and any department across government should deal with, is why are people quitting early? It's that work experience stuff that somehow should be, absolutely has to be, the focus of reform. If you can't make it a good place to work for a young employee, you got a real serious problem coming down. I remember somehow reading there's a lot of people are going to retire soon. So anyway, that goes into creating that environment, and it's a very complex issue. If you read all the stuff you read about Gen Z workers these days, government's failing badly on that point. I think I went too far there, but at any rate, if I can go, I'm not sure how to go back, but the point I only was on that thing, that slide that I just passed over in there. NAPA has talked about essentially career ladders. Their recommendation in that report, No Time to Wait, was basically to create occupational career ladders, because those knowledge jobs are going to be obviously the wave of the future. The competencies are key to that. Somehow this classification system has ignored, the classification system ignores performance, it ignores competencies. Classification system to me is the serious problem here. Leads into career ladders. This government needs career ladders for knowledge jobs is the point. Knowledge jobs being those where your value is not defined by your duties, but it's defined by the value of your knowledge at that point. You can have career ladders. There's no question about career stages. 3 or 4 stages are usually the number that I've seen. I forget exactly what NSPS had, but I do remember that it was one of the criticisms of NSPS was that somehow you couldn't get promotions along the way. It was just one single band almost. That has to be overcome. Expected competency profiles are going to have to be developed for every occupation, I think, and every career stage within those occupations. This is basic and something that government does not do at all, it seems. Every organization in this country spends a lot of time every year following market pay levels. There are thousands of surveys out there. I am one of the biggest critics of BLS surveys at this point. BLS surveys are, to me, are almost worthless, quite frankly. They do not produce data by job level. They do not produce good data by occupation. They are focused on looking at employee salary increases over time, but not actually salary levels at any point. So it's standard. It's standard in every other sector out there. And for some reason, one of the interesting things also to me is the federal wage system. Nobody ever talks about it. It seems to function very nicely. It's basically based on local pay surveys, that are producing data that looks like very much like what you would find in any other sector out there. I do not understand why DOD doesn't place more emphasis on surveys. All right. That's happened. Here we go. What I'm leading up to is that you should have salary bands, and I think those have been proven across a lot of different agencies out there at this point. I did follow it. Actually, they go back, and one of the interesting things also to me is that way back at China Lake, I talked to the HR director at that point a long time ago. That story was something like they merged 2 labs, if you remember these things. When they brought the 2 labs together, it would have been a Navy commander at that point, I believe, it was running the lab. HR came in and said it's going to take 2 years to reclassify all these jobs. Somehow the commander said that's just simply not acceptable. You got to find a better answer. In that context, they would have had a lot of people coming out of the academic world, PhDs, master's degrees, and so forth in there. So they were accustomed to what is essentially a faculty salary schedule, where you got full professor, assistant professor, and so forth. And that is a banded salary program. Banded salary program fit that in that environment nicely. It's proven in other demonstration labs. It is the basis for the NGA pay system, if I'm not correct or not mistaken. I mean, it's an answer, far better answer than the classification system as it exists. Now, the other issue that somehow never comes up in these conversations, the reason that companies in every other sector relies on pay is that somehow it's managed to reinforce what's important, to reinforce what the goals that have to be established. Performance management is probably one of the biggest single failures, I think, in government. And it really does go back to the idea that you can, if you're an employee, you should be able to specify, this is what I need to accomplish this year. Every employee, every manager should also be able to say, this to me would be really great performance. If I accomplish these things, I've had a really great year. You can also, I think, if you're an employee, specify, this is what to me would be failure in this job. Once you've done that, you've automatically defined 3 levels of performance: outstanding performance, acceptable performance or expected, and failure. And as soon as you've done that, you now have some rating scales that you can use to manage performance. One of the things that has happened over the last couple of years is that there was a big story around the state of Tennessee. They invested, as I'm going to talk a little bit about in a minute, but they invested 3 years in preparing managers to manage performance. Pay has to be related. Oh, the other piece of that, by the way, too, I should add here. If you're going to change the culture, you're going to change the culture from this culture of compliance to a culture of performance. Somehow instrumental in that is going to be using pay to reinforce new behaviors. People behave and change only when their behavior is being reinforced usually. The other issue, which again, I'm going to emphasize in here, every time I hear this conversation about performance, the focus is on poor performers. You never hear a conversation like that in the private sector. There clearly are poor performers in every sector, but realistically, they're like 2, 3, 4%, 5% or something at most. Nobody, in my opinion, ever starts their career expecting to be a failure. Somehow that's not surprising, probably. We all want to be successes. And the reason that people fail is normally because of a poor manager. The people that are taking those jobs, all they need is a little coaching. They sometimes may have family problems maybe, but the other reasons that they fail are usually because they're in the wrong job, the wrong fit of their skills. There are reasons for that, but they did not start looking to be a failure. I can assure you that. So shifting from that failure to the outstanding employees would be enormously valuable. You need to have rating scales at that point that are going to be valid and credible. So financial rewards, again, universal practice in other sectors out there. Somehow, and maybe you start only with bonuses, but you need to use some of that money that's set aside for salary increases. Now, I understand the NSPS had a slight problem with that along the way. And I can't begin to explain why, because I wasn't, like I said, we weren't even able to talk to anybody at DOD at that point. But the pay in every other sector has an element of pay for performance. Every other sector has that. It's universal. You stop doing research on it because it's so well established at this point. It all revolves not about the pay side, though. The pay side is a relatively minor part of that. The real issue is performance management, and the real issue is going to be how well the manager handles performance management. Tennessee, as I said, they were, and Steve Goodrich brought a lady around here, Rebecca Hunter is her name. Rebecca was the commissioner of HR for the state. She and I know each other. There's also a good lady, which I would encourage you to bring in sometime. Her name is actually Trish Holiday. She goes by Doc Holiday. She is a doctor. She was the director of learning or training, CLO for the state, that is. At any rate, the state invested 3 years before they made any changes in the pay program. They invested 3 years in changing the behavior of managers. Brought in coaches from the outside, provided training. 3 years. And obviously, if you only got a 4-year term, now's the time to start, because it's going to take a while to get people to prepare people for that role. And finally, all this boils down to then start with the managers. If you're going to change anything, I would start with the managers. And it's not just the training for the managers, it's pay for performance for managers. If anyone needs pay for performance as managers. They should be held accountable. The accountability is defined by the goals that they're expected to accomplish. You don't have the unions necessarily to get in the to cause problems at that point, so you can do it a little bit more quickly. But there should be some form of pay for performance for managers. And if you don't change their behavior, the rest of the reform is not going to take place. That I'm sure of. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Howard. So Janet?
So David, you started by saying Howard was going to be the bomber, or was that you, Peter, that said bomber? I'd like to be the fighter.
All right.
And I sit here and first of all, I want to say I'm so envious about what Veronica does. What a gift to have somebody that will have the passion and the enthusiasm to make the changes that we all agree with. So keep doing what you're doing. Howard, I agree and disagree. First of all, I do think there are people talking about pay for performance. The problem is we don't have an agreed upon path, so you can talk about it. David and I were in the government at the same time and spent a lot of time on pay for performance. And when we set up DHS, I spent 3 years trying to figure out how to get it through. We thought we had the golden opportunity to do it because we had just come out of 9/11. We had Pentagon was still sort of in ashes. We had Shanksville, we had New York, and we had some level of agreement up on the Hill until we started to implement. And we thought we had a process for implementation. We thought that if we had a consolidation of government expertise, union expertise, academic expertise, that we would be able to drive through to a consensus. And what we didn't get is any of those three people agreeing, and we sure didn't get it up on the Hill. So when you're making those kind of fundamental changes, I think you need a fundamental reason. Broken for 70 years isn't a reason. It'd be great if it was. But I sort of think about in the ashes of 9/11, if we can't get it done then, that's a little bit to the resignation. But it really does then, you have to cut it off in slivers. And I think what Peter and I spent a lot of time on was how did you reform OPM, but I think we have to reform it out of the agencies. And you talked about performance management and how do we train that. And there's nothing more important than getting those front end goals agreed to, middle management of how, as you said, how do we get them to understand it and implement it, and then how do we account for it? And I think there are non-monetary ways that I've seen used very successfully, that in fact, if I can't do all of it in pay, I'm going to have to find some other creative ways around a pretty rigorous, rigid, unworkable system. But you started, Veronica, talking about recruitment. I'm so glad to hear the changes. But I think we have to do even more. We have, and you've used some words. I come from now 10 years in the consulting world. How do you brand the federal government? It is so easy if you're Elon Musk and you go to Stanford and you say, I want to hire a young kid and I'm going to make him the manager of the Mars program. I'm going to pay him $10 trillion. I'm actually going to give him a Tesla, and I'm going to give him the responsibility of getting manned mission to Mars. And I'm not going to do it that's easy. So how is it that I recruit a frontline Border Patrol agent because I care about the mission? Or how is it that I get an agricultural? What's that branding? It used to be, we'd say you have longevity. You have certainty, and you have retirement. Weren't those sort of some of our early words that we used? But what is it now? I would say one of your major tools, as you alluded to, is that you have post-pandemic the telework in a flexible environment. And if we don't, we have to figure out the mission for the brand, and then what is it that makes the difference? And how do we engage academics into that? And how do we get the best branding people in the country to sit with the research to be able to figure out how is it that I can recruit for FEMA or HUD or whatever. And it really is about the branding, I think, and understanding what are the jobs? How can I compete with Elon Musk? It's pretty easy if you see fundamentally the changes, if you understand what job you're involved with and how you can see an outcome to the citizens. What I used to talk a lot about was recruit and retain. And you talked about, or somebody about, God, we're losing so many people. I actually think it's okay to lose them. I actually think turnover is good. You can bring in fresher faces, newer ideas. You get a variety. So I worried a lot about it. I mean, because I didn't want to pay to replace all those unhappy TSA workers. There is a cost to that. But isn't it more important? How do I get fresh faces and change? You have to change the job to retain those that you need in some. But in others, what is it that sort of, it's okay if they want to leave because they're getting more responsibility? Or do I need to think about how do I give them more responsibility and opportunities? And one of the things I think we started, and I know they're working really hard on at DHS, is rotation programs. So it's not just when you're an SES candidate, but how do I get a Border Patrol agent to go over and talk to a TSA agent? And then, oh God forbid, they come to headquarters and understand why we've come up with these wacky ideas. So real rotation, I think, can have some job satisfaction, but I would also encourage rotation to the private sector as part of a government program. And bringing in the private sector. You know, the famous stories of when we set up DHS, or actually it was TSA before I even got to DHS. What's the problem we're solving? Let's go find the best expert in the country. So TSA sat and thought, how am I going to set up? What's my biggest problem? It's lines at airports. So where did we go? They went to Disney World because they had to get lines through Mickey Mouse's whatever. And those people came because it was post 9/11 and there was a reason to come. What is it now that can recruit and can get the private sector? We did numerous ones, both at DHS, and I've been involved bringing in both directions. When I was at Deloitte, we brought former or current leaders from justice and treasury and transportation as a 6-month rotation into Deloitte. Heaven forbid the ethics people got tiddly-poo and we had to sign off on both sides. They were not going to work on any procurement that Deloitte might be bidding on inside the government. But let them see what a world-class consulting firm was. And I will tell you, there's a woman now that's a SAC in Baltimore out of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It said she learned more about how to lead and manage because she was at a consulting firm that could actually work through those. Those rules are easy. Tougher when I brought somebody in from the outside because they didn't want to sell their stock portfolio, you know. So we've got to be sure that we're flexible and get lawyers that know how to say yes. But I would, if I were going back in, I'd spend more time on the leadership training and the opportunities to expand. And one other thing, Howard, you referenced, and I think it's important, is what management leadership training do you need for the middle managers? I keep using DHS examples, but we promote the leaders of Border Patrol because they've been on a sector, they know how to stop the immigration flow, but did we give them the tools and grow on the way through? So management training, including you had to have I would say you had to have a stint in the finance office, a stint in the procurement office, and a stint in the HR office, and have that as part of it. Most of them don't want to come out of the field because that's where their passion is. But if you're going to go and grow, I think those mandatory rotations are important in the management skills that develop the leaders that can help. The other thing that I've been engaged with in the last 2 years, and I was talking to Peter about it before, I am now consulting in my ripe old age because I can pontificate very easily now because there's no consequences to it, for some mid-managers. And I'm doing what's called mentor coaching. And it's really interesting. I don't think I knew about it when I was in government. But these young SESs need a voice and somebody to listen to. So how do I get past this problem? I help somebody get confirmed because they were struggling with the new appointee coming in. Well, I've had a little experience in that. But just having an outside voice to talk to. And I really do think, Peter, I think you were saying that defense has one, but they assign a mentor coach. Have you assigned a retired mentor coach, somebody from the civilian or private sector or defense, to give those identified leaders opportunities to grow? So I'm a big one on sort of what are the diversified training skills, and it sure isn't on the frontline mission. It is about much more the management. I think Howard, you talked about it. We've talked a long time. Should we let people ask questions?
Well, if I could jump in first,
Yeah.
because I don't want to give the impression that I'm not thinking about all the things.
Yes, I know.
And while I focused on hiring, initially, if you ask me what are the things that keep you up at night, or what are the things that I think we have to focus on, it's all of the things that both you and Howard have talked about. And I would offer that compensation broadly, we have tried the big boom, whether it's through National Security Personnel System or through our China Lake or acquisition demo. And what we have found is, and what we're thinking about is not every position and not every occupation or function needs pay for performance. So what are the right systems that we need for the right functional areas? If we're thinking about future work, modernization, artificial intelligence, digital, is that an area where paper performance makes sense, right? If I'm turning wrenches, maybe not so much. So,
But you still need winch people to have some job satisfaction. And how do you?
well, that's what I was going to talk about next. So then from an engagement and resiliency perspective, and we have found over the pandemic, our engagement numbers increase, right? So there's something there to look at, but we find the Gen Zers, we find the folks coming into government, and to your point, you're probably most engaged your first day at work, right? You're excited, you want to be there, you want to make a difference. We need to make sure culturally, institutionally, that what the environment that they're walking into, if I'm an exquisite data scientist or I'm a coder, and I come into this overly bureaucratic, cumbersome, antiquated environment that doesn't actually let me code, or I end up working on something else, I'm going to lose that engagement. I'm going to lose that retention. And so those are the things we're thinking about holistically, not just the hiring, it's the performance, it's the engagement. And I agree with you, Janet, on pathways to service. Longevity and a retirement isn't necessarily what motivates entry level, might mid-level, it may, entry level. And so we have to, I focus on hiring because we have to make it easier for folks who want to serve the country to serve the country. And we need to make it easier for them to come in and out of government so that they bring their private sector skills into government. But we also want them to go get development, to your point, back out and be able to come back in. In our current system, in some instances, they're still in the back of the line as if they've never served before. And so very passionate about those particular areas because we have to figure this out for the workforce of 2040 if we're going to be competitive.
And you're going to see it more when they've now had the post-pandemic environment.
Yeah.
But you'll learn so much by going out and coming in, and you get blocked often. You talked about how to modernize veteran preference. You got to figure out a way to let those people go out and come back in and not be hindered. So anyway, we can continue. What do you think?
Great. This is great. So we have a little over 15 minutes for questions. Let me ask for questions from the audience first and see if any pop up here. Anyone? Oh, Peter Levine.
I'm trying to avoid it asking but you all touched on something that is a issue, and I want to get to a distinction that I think is important. Howard, you put up a slide about market pay rates, and I think that's important. But I think in my view, I've always had this concern: market-based pay is something different from performance-based pay.
Mm-hmm.
Market-based pay to me is about getting the people into the workforce who want to have the workforce. So if we're offering $60,000 for coders and Google is offering $170,000 for coders, and you want the same people, we're not the same market. We're not going to get the people we want. Performance-based pay is something different. It's about, you know, so then you have setting the right objectives. That to me is a management. You can do the performance management system, or you can do it just through management. Then there's how hard are people working? That's your performance based. I think that confusing the two to me is helpful because
I
we need to decide what our objectives are when we set our pay system. And it may be easier to do market-based pay and have more bang for the buck than doing performance-based pay. Always revert to performance-based pay. So I wonder whether our panel can comment on that.
Peter, if I can, one of the things that starting salaries for STEM jobs are clearly deficient, way too low probably. But more importantly than that, I think, is that, and it goes to the issue of not pay for performance, but I'm going to call fair pay, is that over a course of a career, people need to think that they're going to be treated fairly and that the pay increases are going to reflect their value and that somehow they're going to be roughly in line with what they could be earning someplace else. That's not happening right now. And that's really the issue. It's not just pay for performance, it's how the pay is administered so people think we're going to be paid fairly. And I, right at the moment, I don't think they do.
Yeah, and I think it's both, Peter. You know, we are focused on market pay for the skills that need market pay. And you give an example, and getting the authorities to secure that. And we've had some success, whether it's in our intel community, in our cyber community, in using some pay flexibilities. I think on the performance side, as we think about pay for performance, I quite frankly, I still think we're recovering from NSPS. If you think of a broad application of pay for performance, but I think there's still opportunity when you look at our defense performance management and appraisal program. Sorry, I threw the acronym there, and that drives that discussion. To your point around what are the objectives, what are you going to accomplish, and have those conversations. Where we have opportunity, where we've been focused is, can we make sure that we're recognizing the high performers, right? Not just the poor performers, and not just have an annual discussion, right? An annual bonus. How can we do real-time recognition, monetary, non-monetary, for our highest performers? And we've really been trying to drive our components to think about spreading that use across the year to maintain motivation and engagement throughout the year. And I think, I don't know that we would ever pivot, at least from a strategy perspective, to big bang pay for performance, but there are certainly levers we have that can get at that that motivational factor, that compensation motivational factor.
And I agree. I think one of the issues, as I saw from my management lens, is I may want to get more money into the pay line. I go up to see the appropriators and they want 10 more Border Patrol agents. They don't, it's not sexy to pay them more. It's sexier to have the absolute. I think the question becomes, what's the motivating factor that gets you both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue done? Well, the authorizers and appropriators, whatever it is, and we need to get more dollars into that pay line. We're going to have to work on our rhetoric and our stakeholder evaluation about how does it make a difference. I can't just go out to the district where there's the appropriator sits and say you can pay Joe more. We're going to have leaders at both ends.
I think Dr. Chu had his hand up first and then you, sir.
You've all touched on a variety of what one might call supply side issues. How does the department get the talent it needs on board? I wondered if we could comment on the demand side issue. How does one decide where civilians should be working? It would be consistent, Veronica, with your moving toward a more cohort hiring kind of approach. Maybe we should have more civilians, and if so, what the process of the department for that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, we've talked about workforce rationalization over many years, and certainly part of the national defense strategy. What's the right mix of the civilian side, not just as enablers, which is typically what we're thought of, mission enablers, and certainly that's our role, but we see civilians in mission centric, right? Mission provision focused area, and so you know, from a demand side, that's exactly what we're sort of grappling with, finding the right balance, particularly in areas where you could have, whether you could have a civilian or you could have a military member, right? And how do you make the decision whether to invest in the civilian resources Certainly signals from the Hill are concerned, have expressed concern about any attempts to reduce the size of the civilian workforce, making sure that it's tied to mission essentiality and some other decisions. So from a demand side, we're having those conversations on what are the staffing requirements that we need. Quite frankly, you heard me talk quite a bit about data analytics, and part of the challenge with that is we have a variety of disparate systems to let us really understand where our talent is, where our needs are, so that we can adequately articulate from a data perspective what are the skills and the staffing requirements that we need so that we can make that case. That's certainly an area that we're focusing on that ties into demand side, right? The size of the civilian workforce in the particular areas that we invest in.
And David, I would say we went through on the other side of the river that that balance between, again, sexier to get a new border patrol agent than it is to get an HR specialist. Lots easier to get those numbers through. But then you take time and you make those mission focused people do management functions they don't really want to do. And is it more effective and efficient to let those guys go do their mission job? And we spend a lot of time saying, I can increase our productivity by 10 or 20% if I get them out of that management mission support functions. That had some success up on the Hill. But it also then, on the other side, takes them out of learning the management process. And so we had to weigh both about, I want more on the support side, but I want you to learn and I want to make you understand what it is because it'll make it more efficient. But getting them out of doing somebody else's job was our first step in that process.
If I just true to thought on this issue with Veronica, either military or civilian. Look at the British experience with so-called sponsored reserves. You could have two things too, which you could give civilians reserve appointments such that, look at the cyber, for example, with a military person because it's an active war, potentially. Well, you can give the civilians reserve appointments and upon an administrative decision, convert them overnight to military status. So I would urge a broader thinking about how we can use it.
Yeah, I think you've been a fly on the wall. We've had lots of conversations about permeability, and that exactly goes to that, in the notion of reserve corps. And we're certainly, those are signals we're getting from the Hill as well. What are non-traditional ways of thinking about talent and bringing folks into government and out of government? And reserve corps is exactly another potential avenue. Yeah.
So I agree with you. I would just caution, and you might want to spend some time understanding the history of FEMA's reserve. 2-year corps, 4-year corps. I don't have enough here on the permanent. And how do if you get them over here, how hard is it to convert? So there is a lesson learned.
Or 1 month corps. I have a finite need for
Right.
Expertise to come in and solve a specific issue. How do we keep them primed to be able to do that? Clearance, et cetera. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to tackle it.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, sir.
So when you look at beyond just pay for performance, is there an opportunity for motion for performance? Analogous to the free market where you have great idea, great execution, you could billionaire or leader the next type of space based on there an opportunity for foster.
Yeah, the question was how to make performance a central tenet of promotion opportunities if you've been a proven performer. We have you talk about the 70-year-old system. We've got this rank and position, and your rank and your ability to promote is tied to your ability to go to a position with a higher level of expertise or skills or responsibility. And that's certainly, we've got systems in the department that are rank and person, right? To your point, you've got proven competency, skills, expertise, delivered results. We see that in the intelligence community as an area where we have rank and person. Quite frankly, the military is another area. It doesn't matter where you're sitting. And those are things that we are exploring because we see, this notion of you must spend 12 months in a time and grade before you can promote to the next level. isn't a model that we think is going to be should be the primary model for the future. And so those are conversations we're having not only within the department, we're having within the national security community as part of our revitalization of the national workforce, and more broadly across the interagency with OPM, because we think there's a role to having a merit but rank and person based system. But we've also got to be able to do that in a way that preserves merit. And so finding that right balance, and then to your point, Janet, bringing all the stakeholders together, because that's radically different approach. And so getting alignment from all the communities that would have a voice in that, and what are we solving for, right?
Yeah.
So, but it's certainly an idea that we've been thinking about.
Let me comment on that also. One of the things about the OPM and pay reform in 1990 was that this was Connie Newman at the time as director of OPM. And Connie obviously had meetings of, I don't know, 20, 30 people every couple of months, it seemed. We also had just an incredible number of sort of behind the scenes kind of meetings. But you need to get people on board. And one of the things that is always true of reform to me is you get people to buy into what you're trying to accomplish. And that means that all the stakeholders, again, need to be involved in that process. Then the guy's name was John Sturdivant, who was the president of AFGE. And John and I turned out to be pretty good friends. I used to visit him in his office quite often. But he was on board. Tobias was on board. I mean, that was a relatively modest kind of a change at that point, in just going to locality pay. But you need to get people to buy into the changes, that's not the way I think, I could be wrong, not the way the military works normally, I don't believe. But you need to get, and also this is like ground floor kind of people to get into that job and into the process so they all understand why. One of the things that's true of the academic world, John was at Penn at one point, I understand. I've done a lot of pay programs, kinds of stuff in the academic world for colleges and universities. And they always have a committee that's involved in that process. That's collegiality. And they have a committee, if it's going to cover secretaries, somehow there are secretaries on that committee. If it's going to cover engineers, there are engineers on that committee. They're always involved in the change process. They make the decisions. They own the decisions at that point. They are taken very seriously. They go back home and they talk to their coworkers and tell them what's going on. So they communicate that process. Anyway, it worked very well when it's done that way. And I absolutely think every organization should do that. So
I worry a little bit. I couldn't agree with you more about getting the communities together and in this much more partisan world that I think most of us that grew up in government, you got to be able to give up something so that your community is, the stakeholders are engaged, and the ability to give up in this much more, not Republican and Democrat, but liberal or conservative or whatever it is, you got to be able to get the consensus and the rhetoric toned down, and then the agreement, and then the path forward. And the politics and small p politics, I think, is what needs more time than what's the actual substantive answer. It's come up with what the goal is and then figure out the process to get there. And who needs a bridge in West Virginia, or how many more miles do we need to pave in New York? I mean, what is the trade-off? And it may have nothing to do with what you're doing.
I think we have time for one more question here. You've been patient.
I want to first thank Veronica. We got to work together a little bit, Pentagon, and it's great when you were invited to be part of this, because I think 2017, 21 time, right, some of the best primary assignment that's performance at your office. And a lot of people about it. And I was a user of some of those hiring. So it's that. A little bit of a curveball question. We talked a little bit about GS system. My question pertains to the SES tiers, tiering approach at DOE. So we talked a lot about incentives and efficiency, finding opportunities to strengthen budgets, programs, workforces. The structure of the SES tiering system seems to be reversed if we are asking the SESs to reduce their number of their bandwidth, their number of programs, the number of people on my workforce and spend less. I think one of the things you can observe is that when you ask somebody who has a vested interest in maintaining their budget and their spending control, you're asking them to shrink that without compensation. You don't have to shot at seeing that through. So my question is and I know the tiering system is not used at every department. Is the tiering structure outdated or in conflict to some of the budgetary outcomes that we'd like to see? If it's not obsolete overall, how could one restructure the basis for SDS tiers to provide more of those types of incentives that a lot of people don't talk about necessarily? Another example, the idea of pushing decisions down, right? The department actively limits the ability to participate in decisions based on precedents, right? So things flow up to the top. If we want to not flow up to the top, how can we enable it? How do we create a system that doesn't require a tier 3 SDS to decide?
That's a lot to unpack. The question was on SES reform, particularly the tiers, and I would say cultural decision-making of the department. So on the tiering part of it, I will share, we went through that under the previous administration. We did a 1.5-year study on the tiers, in particular for senior executives. And I've worked in both an agency that doesn't have tiers and DOD, which is sort of my home agency. And when we study this, you know, as you allude to, it's mixed across government. And what we found is, and what we recommitted to under leadership, is that there is a place for tiers. There is a place. We operate in a department that has a hierarchical nature as its culture. So there is a role for tiers to help civilians integrate into the broader military construct. But we also recognize that having hard barriers did not necessarily enable retention for our executives that were looking for pay acceleration across the executive pay spectrum. And we recognized we needed an ability to recognize our highest executives, whether you're tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. If you were achieving the results and the outcomes that the department asked you to achieve, hitting an artificial pay cap wasn't necessarily and isn't necessarily the right answer in terms of retention. And so we actually put policy changes in place last year that enable individuals and leadership to exceed tier caps, right? So it's a recognition that we need a flexible system, that there's value for the tiers, but we need to be able to move folks through them if they're high performers, and not necessarily set boundaries. So we recognize that as a challenge, and we took steps to address it. And the data has proven worthwhile, that folks are using it across the tiers. I think to your second part, you know, pushing decision down to tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. You know, I'm a tier 1 executive in DoD, but I think I have outsized influence from where I sit in terms of what I've engaged in and what I've been able to work on in the interagency, and to influence the broader interagency conversation, and to influence the conversation within the department at the most senior levels. So I think some of it is making sure that our executives feel empowered and feel equipped and comfortable in their expertise to bring that to the conversation and to the table to drive decisions. But I think also, you know, I recognize that we operate in that hierarchical environment where you're going to have your most senior level decision makers, whether they're executives or whether they're military, weigh in on the most critical decisions. And so, you know, it's my job, in my role, I'm also the senior executive functional manager for the department. So thinking about competencies for our executives to make sure that we're developing and grooming executives that feel comfortable operating in that environment and can be very vocal in what they bring to the table from a decision space.
Could I make a quick comment?
Sure,
One
yes.
very, very, very quick. Yeah. If one of the things that you may have seen me smile a couple of times here. One of the things that I absolutely believe in is delegating stuff down to the lowest possible level. If you go to the private sector, an enormous number of people that are basically self-managed. They don't have a boss anymore. They operate, function on their own, and somehow government doesn't seem to buy into that idea, and I don't understand why.
So let me thank Janet, Howard, and Veronica for a great session. I know there were some questions that didn't get answered. We'll try to follow up with those later, but in the interest of time, I think we need to move on to lunch. So thank you all very much.